Hi, everybody. My name is Barry Sargent. I'm here on behalf of Aotearoa Workers Solidarity Movement, which is an anarchist group in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is part two of an interview that was started recently with researcher Byron Clark, covering his recent book, which looks at the extreme right in Aotearoa, New Zealand. During the first interview, we just did an overview of the general contents of the book. And this time around, we're going to discuss a little bit about some of the chapter contents, although we won't spoil it too much, I think, for potential readers down the track, I hope. So let's jump into it. I guess we're going to start off straight away with chapter one, although it's a bit of a biggie in terms of a question.
Mm.
So in chapter one, you talk about the progression that people take sometimes that lands them eventually on the far right. For example, you reference people such as Lauren Southern, Stefan Molyneux, Jordan Peterson, how somebody might begin as, say, an anti-feminist as a result of reading their work, and then move on to, say, being racist, and then perhaps actually formally joining a far right group. Or perhaps another example being vaccine hesitancy leading to vaccine resistance, leading to QAnon. So I guess the question I had around that is, do you see that as the standard progression? And as a corollary, if so, is it reversible?
Mm. Yeah, it's a progression that's there, but it's not inevitable that people will progress that way. I
Hmm.
mean, someone like Jordan Peterson, I think his book, it was 12 Rules for Life book, he's written a couple of others, has sold about 5 million copies. And, there's not 5 million people have gone out and read the book and then ended up on the alt-right. You can get you can get your self-help advice and a little bit of conservatism and just kind of leave it there. So I think it's not an inevitability that someone will pick up something like that and start on that dark path into the alt-right. Um, on YouTube, maybe they're a little bit more likely to, with the algorithms that'll recommend you more and more extreme content, although they've done a few things in the last couple of years to try and prevent that happening, though arguably not enough. Um, the other side of it, I guess, is that, and I think this is the reason that not everyone who picks up a Jordan Peterson book is going to end up in this space, is it's also the economic marginalization that a lot of these people are having. And I don't want to overstate that aspect of it, because it's economic marginalization that they blame on more marginalized groups. So it's often young white men who feel that they are being denied what is owed to them by society, and they blame, feminism or, social justice warriors and so on. So, there's that resentment and that anger there. And if you start to get what looks like a kind of intellectual justification for the anger and the resentment you feel, then that can, push you further down. And I think someone who's not feeling so much anger and resentment, might pick up 12 Rules for Life and just, work on their own well-being and keeping their room tidy, do better than me with the boxes at the back or whatever, um, do that, and, and not end up as some kind of far right actor. But someone who's already got a bit of that anger and resentment there, they can then go down that path, which might start with Peterson and then go to Molyneux and go to more extreme people. Or, with the anti-vaccine stuff, a lot of it was people who, losing their livelihoods during the pandemic. A lot of small, medium business owners who, suddenly couldn't trade. And while in this country we did have, quite a fair bit of subsidies for wages and things, people did lose out. And, they were angry, resentful of that. And so it becomes not just I'm not sure I want to get this vaccine. I have concerns about it. It becomes an anti-government, anti-supranational organization like the World Health Organization and the UN. And this then pathway to believing in some kind of global conspiracy. So it's that mix of factors, having the material there, but having the audience for that material too, who are already, angry and resentful. And so if we did some things to prevent people from being angry and resentful, I think that would stop people going down that path as well.
Mm. Yeah, I was going to mention that in relation particularly with Action Zealandia. I thought you had a great quote here. Um, Action Zealandia are not driven to a violent ideology by marginalization, but by entitlement and a disdain, if not outright hatred, for genuinely marginalized groups. So it's that psychological basis to it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think sometimes we on the left can overstate that economic marginalization and say, oh, we need to be looking at economic security and jobs and all of that stuff is stuff that is really important. And I think it would help, you know, people not be radicalized. But it's not just the marginalization, because if marginalization was causing people to be radicalized, we'd have a lot more women being radicalized, a lot more immigrants, a lot more indigenous people, not necessarily into far right activism, but into some kind of radical action. It's that combination of the economic marginalization with the entitlement that comes with being a white straight male, feeling like you're not getting the job you're entitled to, or the wife you're entitled to in the family, and all that idea of what at least straight white men could have in this country in the 20th century that other people were never fully entitled to. But neoliberalism has kind of pushed everyone down. So there are groups who maybe have always been oppressed, and then there's this group of young white men who feel that they specifically have been pushed down from their rightful place. And that's an ideology that Peterson's work really can reinforce, and then they can go from Peterson to the more extreme stuff.
Mm, mm. Okay, yeah. Um, Actually, in the chapter relating to Action Zealander, I was quite interested by the fact um, that you named Brenton Tarrant
Mm,
in there, and I couldn't help but think of it in contrast to Jacinda Ardern's refusal to do so. And
mm,
I guess given this week's events with her farewell in Parliament and her work around the Christchurch call, I was just wondering what you thought about that, both the naming of somebody or not, and
mm.
specifically the Christchurch call, if you had an opinion on that.
Yeah, so I think the not naming him is a good thing. Don't give him that notoriety. Most of the media sort of had the policy of they might name him in the text of an article, but not in the headline or a blurb.
Mm,
Um, then you get Jeff Sparrow wrote a whole book without naming him, even
yeah.
though it was on the
Mm,
Christchurch shooting and the far right in relation to that. But I didn't specifically avoid naming him, but I think his name's in there once or twice, and
once, it's
I've
once, yeah.
just
Yeah.
once, yeah. So again, not wanting to splash his name everywhere, but you know, uh, not going full like he must not be named with it either. Just having
Yeah.
it. I think realistically, if you're reading my book, you know his name. So
Mm,
yeah.
mm. Um, and what do you think about the availability of the manifesto that he wrote? Because I think there's a somewhat of a paradox there. I
Mm,
have read it myself, and I didn't see it as being. It's got no originality to it. It's just a rehash of a whole lot of stuff that's out there. But my understanding, if I'm correct, is that it's not allowed to be distributed, and I
mm,
think part of the difficulty becomes, on the one hand, you know, I don't at all support the views entailed in that. But then on the one hand, in order to know what you're against, you have to be exposed to it.
mm.
So there's a bit of a paradox there. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand the rationale by censoring the manifesto. We're wanting to avoid, people picking it up and then carrying out sort of similar atrocities, which unfortunately we have seen overseas. I mean, there's mass shooters in the US who, cite
Mm,
that manifesto as inspiration, and of course the US is not going to censor it because they have their
mm,
First Amendment. They have very much more sort of free speech, freedom of the press than what we have here. And debate whether which country has it right or wrong, but that's the reality that outside this small country, most people can get their hands on that and read it. Um, One difficulty I have found with the manifesto being censored is a lot of the sort of alt-right in New Zealand don't necessarily support what Tarrant did or even his whole ideology. And because of that, they will say things like, oh, he was actually a leftist environmentalist,
mm,
and that's why the government is censoring his manifesto. So you can't learn this. And I'll see people say, oh, I read it before it was banned. And, he talks about his admiration of communist China and they're cherry picking things and taking them out of context. And of course, if people can't go and check that for themselves, they're possibly going to believe that. Or I haven't read the full manifesto myself, but I've read lots of media reporting from people who have, like the Jeff Sparrow book I mentioned. I tried to get the local library to get that, but they quickly got back to me and said they're not having it on their shelves because it may be contempt of court. When the trial was still happening, so I got myself a copy from, and that contains a lot of information, as does some of the reporting that's been done from places like Bellingcat and other overseas media. So I cited those reporting rather than going directly to the manifesto. But I didn't feel I really needed to because the book doesn't focus very much on Tarrant. It's
mm.
more about the people who are here um, and what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the focus, if you look at the chapters, it's quite clearly the more organized group form of the phenomenon,
Mm,
really, isn't it? Yeah,
mm,
yeah. Okay. You have a chapter here on the Christian right. And I think it's probably fair to say, in terms of media coverage for at least a decade or more, that Brian Tamaki is the one who's been doing the running on that.
mm,
He seems to be, amongst people, when the subject comes up, he's the first name that most people think of, and quite legitimately,
mm,
he's been very active. But there are people like Peter Morlock and so on who
mm,
perhaps you could argue have a bigger reach and so on. And um, in discussions I've had with some people, they've actually suggested that maybe there's an unconscious racism possibly
mm,
going on, that Tamaki is Maori and taking these sort of stances, whereas the Pākehā, similar people who are Pākehā, seem to have flown under the radar this whole time, and yet in some ways have more membership and perhaps more influential in other ways, but the media hasn't had the focus on them. Is there
mm.
anything in that criticism, do you think?
I think there is. I've heard that sort of criticism largely from David Farrier, who's written a lot about these
Mm,
evangelical mega churches, and yeah, I think it's a real point. I think there's been a lot of like media coverage of Destiny Church, and part of the reason for that is I think they're quite easy to like see as this outside group because it's this sort of charismatic. Well, I don't know if I'd call him charismatic, but this leader who's adopting the sort of American evangelical style, but then his congregation will like ride motorcycles and wear like fake gang patches and things. So so
mm,
so it's some of that same, that the way that like gangs are othered in the media coverage. I mean, you can do that to Destiny Church, and I think that happens at the expense of maybe looking at some of these more predominantly Pākehā congregations at places like City Impact or Elam or some of the sort of non-affiliated evangelical Christians who might be involved with like groups like Family First, which is if you read their material, it's often just as reactionary as what Destiny Church is putting out, but
Mm.
maybe not done in this sort of bold way. And I think visual media, especially like television, they want those images that look like that. And a similar thing with how a lot of TV coverage of the far right will focus on like the people who turned up at the Posey Parker rally recently with the skull masks and the bucket hats and their flags. And there were people there who didn't dress like that but hold very similar views, and I think visual media sort of makes us look at those people who look different and who are others, and that's at the expense of looking at how some of these views exist with people who could be our neighbors, our co-workers, and so forth. The that evangelical Christian community is predominantly Pākehā, and they're promoting similar things to what Brian Tamaki and Destiny Church is, perhaps not with the same kind of fire and brimstone rhetoric, but it comes close at times.
Yeah, the optics of it are quite interesting, isn't it? And I think psychologically, it makes people feel more comfortable if you can do that othering, because having to face the fact that you're literally your next door neighbor could hold very similar views, but is Pākehā and therefore just like me, and it's harder to sort of sleep at night, if you like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I was very interested in the chapter that you had on QAnon, particularly the one quite striking fact that you mentioned is that New Zealand had the second most related tweets per capita related to QAnon. Um, and at first sight, from an outside perspective, you just think that's really bizarre, because QAnon, on the face of it, although it is sort of a meta conspiracy in a way, it is very American, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So what do you think's going on there? Like, how do you explain that New Zealand, of all places, is like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, per capita means we're small enough that just a small group of people making a lot of tweets could, skew the statistics. Because,
Mm,
obviously, by the numbers, QAnon is biggest in the United States.
yeah,
It's also quite big in Germany for some reason. That seems to be where there's
yeah,
quite a lot of it. But I think as a percentage of the population, it's still a minority of Americans, even a minority of, Trump supporters are actually getting full on into this conspiracy theory. But I think there's been some significant QAnon influences here. One of them I mentioned in the book is Damien Dement, who's I think he's a dual citizen of the US and New Zealand. He's lived in both countries, and so he votes in US elections and he pays close attention to politics there. So he's been a significant QAnon influencer, and I think that that's one of the reasons some of this very American theory has been, brought into this country. But there's plenty of people who don't have a connection to the United States who are adapting different bits of it as well. Like, a lot of the rhetoric around, the elites harming children and harvesting their adrenochrome and things. That's, it's a rehash of satanic panic sort of stuff. And there's a few people who have sort of latched onto that aspect of it. And I talk about this a little bit in the Woman in the Far Right chapter, how, women with, perhaps very genuine concerns about, child well-being and issues like human trafficking have jumped onto, this QAnon theory because a lot of the theory is around children being harmed. And that's caused a few people here to get behind it as well, perhaps for different reasons from, Dement, for whom it's more about, Trump being the glorious leader or whatever. But so people have had different things that have brought them in, but it's appealed to a lot of New Zealanders, despite being a very American theory. And part of that might just be the sort of hegemonic influence that US politics and US culture has on especially the English speaking world, but arguably the whole world.
And absolutely. And as you say, I suppose on an emotional level, I mean, anything that brings in kids, that's
Mm.
that's going to resonate with a large number of people. Kids are in. I mean, who's going to defend kids getting harmed, right?
Mm,
So you've got a good psychological starting basis anyway. And I think the other thing with the Trump aspect of it is you've got clear black and white demarcation. Good guys, bad guys. It's a narrative anyone can follow and latch onto, isn't it? So it's
yeah,
I think if you put those two together, yeah, even without the local context of it, it's sort of just very powerful stuff, isn't it? I suppose.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, you've got a chapter here about Advanced New Zealand. Um,
Mm,
and you've got a quote here where you said 28,000 voters do not just change their views when their party folds.
mm.
Um, where will they go?
Yeah, I mean we can see a couple of places where they've gone. One is Voices for Freedom, who was founded by number 3 on the advanced party list, and they've started out as an anti-vaccine movement largely, but they're now expanding to cover more, in particular climate change conspiracy theories. Been listening to a little bit of their new media platform they've launched, and they're right into this whole climate denialism, Great Reset, anti-UN Agenda 2030, all that sort of stuff. I haven't actually heard them talk a lot about vaccines, just in what I've listened to anyway. So they're a pole of attraction for, I think, those same people who voted for advanced, and many who didn't, because I think they have the advantage, by not being a political party, of avoiding some of the sort of sectarianism that exists in that space, and being able to be a larger and broader group. And they're claiming 100,000 people on their mailing list, and branches in different parts of the country and things. So they might be exaggerating, and how what does being on a mailing list really mean?
Mm.
Um, but there certainly are a lot of people who've got involved in that. Another one that came out of Advance, actually founded on election night once it became clear they weren't going to get into Parliament. A few of their candidates from the provincial South Island founded the Agriculture Action Group, which then held meetings in the provinces promoting various conspiracy theories about climate change, the UN, and a lot of sovereign citizen adjacent stuff. So people have gone into that. And I think others will have gone to some of these other parties, whether that's Sue Gray's Outdoors and Freedoms Party, or whether it's whatever the Tamakis end up with, whether it's Vision New Zealand or Freedom New Zealand, or and then there's the former National MP Matt King, who's now started his party. There's a lot of competition in this space for the same
Mm.
pool of voters. So while some of those people, I think, maybe post the height of the pandemic, and I want to say post pandemic because we're still in the pandemic, but post the height of it, perhaps they've kind of gone back to their normal lives, and aren't engaging so much with this kind of content online. But I think many of them will, in this year's election, find themselves getting in behind Sue Gray or Matt King, or or Brian and Hannah Tamaki. So
Mm. And which
yeah.
which of those among them would, I mean, this is just pure speculation, I suppose, but which of those do you think might ultimately have the most appeal electorally?
Mm. I think of those sort of fringe parties, probably the one with the widest appeal is the New Conservatives. And I think part of the reason for that, though, is that they're appealing to a wider audience than just that conspiracist fringe. I think they're getting a lot of people who are like single issue voters around the issue of abortion, particularly with the changes to abortion legislation that have happened recently. That's a really hot button issue for a lot of Christian voters, and New Conservatives probably the most likely to pull those groups in. They actually may alienate some of the more conspiracy theory types, though, because under their current leadership, they are trying to distance themselves a bit from that far right label that clung to them last election when they had Leighton Baker and Elliot Ekeley leading the party. So maybe some people who might otherwise be inclined to vote for them will gravitate more to Sue Gray or even to Matt King. I think Sue Gray is really going to be pushing the anti-vaccine stuff harder than you conservatives, and Matt King's probably going to be pushing the climate change stuff and appealing to rural voters. So, depending on what the primary issue is, you might go
Yeah.
one of three ways there.
Right, got you. Yeah. Um, I was quite interested in your experience of dealing with the Broadcasting Standards Authority.
Mm.
Um, and it sounded like the process involved there, and people can read the book obviously to get a bit more background on it. But it seemed like a very drawn out process, about 6 months in all.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm wondering how you felt about that, whether you'd recommend it to people who are having an issue, and that would be something to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of cases where that's available. I mean, there's so many of these, alternative media platforms now.
Mm.
Whether that's the, relatively moderate the platform, or whether it's Reality Check Radio, the one that Voice of Freedom is behind, or whether it's Counterspin Media. They're all online only, which means they're not covered by the Media Council or the Broadcasting
Mm,
Standards Authority.
yeah.
Um, I was able to go to the Broadcasting Standards Authority in the case of Talanoa Sao because they were broadcast on TV, on Apna Television, which is Freeview Channel 36. And um, I think this is only the second Broadcasting Standards Authority complaint that they've got. I think not enough people are aware this channel exists to be complaining. The people aren't, channel surfing right up to 36 very often. But I knew the show broadcast on there, and I knew they were getting Dement on, and suspected he would say some inaccurate things, to put it lightly. So I watched the episode on Freeview, and then they also post all the episodes on Facebook, so I was able to download it and sort of recheck, make sure I got some quotes right and things afterwards. And yeah, very slow process. It was months after the episode had aired that the ruling was made. They had to pay a small fine and broadcast a correction. The Broadcasting Standards Authority doesn't have the power to make a station cancel a show, but APNA opted to cancel Talanoa Sao because of this. I think it just became a risk to them, a financial risk and a reputational risk as well, probably, to carry that material. But Talanoa Sao is still going, just online only, and so we're very limited now with just with these online platforms, and I think it's going to be a very difficult, well, not difficult, but a very big debate if we try and, as a society, try and bring in some kind of regulations around this. I think, very few people claim that the Broadcasting Standards Authority is an affront to free speech, but just in the political environment we're in, I think if the government would to try and bring in something similar for online content or for social media, I think they'd have a lot of political difficulty getting that over the line, just as they haven't been able to um, enact the hate speech provisions in the Human Rights Act that the Royal Commission report into the mosque shooting recommended. I think it's just politically too difficult to do, particularly in an election year. So I don't know if we're going to see any regulation of that online space. We're very much relying on um, platforms to self-regulate, which, the Christchurch call is maybe having some influence on, at least when it comes to the likes of Facebook and YouTube. Twitter less so now that Musk has brought it and his whole free speech absolutist ideology. And then there's these other places like Rumble and Telegram that just aren't going to be part of it, aren't going to participate, because their business model really is giving a platform to the people who are kicked off all those mainstream platforms. So,
Yeah.
it's not an easily it's not the only strategy we can rely on is regulation and so on, because um I don't think it made, I don't know if it made it into the book, but there's a quote from one of the founders of the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, who do civil liberties stuff related to internet and technology. And he said back in the 90s that the network interprets censorship as a flaw and routes around it. And, that's a very good thing if you're living in a, regime like Iran or
Mm,
China or
mm.
whatever. But it does also mean that if there's some sort of censorship of your anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, there'll be somewhere else on that global network of the internet where you can put those up. You get banned from YouTube, you go on Rumble, and you then promote it to your audience on Telegram because you got banned from Facebook. It's there's um and people have a smaller audience perhaps on some of these platforms than um, the mainstream social media. But I think because of how slowly mainstream social media acted, it was too little too late. And everyone who was following these YouTube and Facebook channels could then shift over to these alternative platforms, because for quite a while people were operating on both platforms. I think Voices for Freedom has more of a following on Telegram now than they've had on Facebook, and now they've got their own media station doing their audio broadcasts every day. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
see what you mean. It's
yeah,
always going to be a case of playing catch up, right? Because they'll
exactly,
just
yeah.
jump to another thing, and
Mm,
yeah, I think that's where the whole shift to the internet has been it has been a paradigm shift in terms of
mm,
legal enforcing versus self-regulation, hasn't it?
mm,
Just to wrap up, I see we're sort of running out of time a bit, but that's fine. Um, I just wanted to skip to chapter 22, which basically concerned the protests outside Parliament.
mm,
And I could be wrong, but in a sense, the way the book is written, the chapters all sort of break down the organizations who were there, and it sort of prefigures the
mm,
protest, and that's the ultimate sort of focal point. And then it's as if everybody else just saw this big mass of people, um, and didn't know what it was all about. But if they read your book, you've gone and worked backwards from that and broken it
mm.
into all the little parts. So when you get to chapter 22, it's like, that's who was there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Was that how you sort of perceived that chapter?
Yeah, that was how I decided to sort of lay out the book.
Mm,
Look, I talk about that event in the introduction, but ultimately it's that not the final chapter, but the penultimate chapter where
mm,
we get to the protest, and like you summarized there. I want people to read the book. Why, by the time they get to that chapter, to know who all these groups and who all these individuals are, what they believe, what they're doing, what led to them being there. And I think when the protest actually happened just over a year ago, a lot of you know average people were surprised, because while there'd been a bit of anti-vaccine murmuring and things, like you read the comments on any news article on Facebook, you'd see that. I think a lot of people didn't realize just how big this movement had got online, and there's a bit of a tendency, I think, to treat the online world as if it's not real, and that contributed to it. But I think also a lot of the media had been operating on whether they were doing it consciously or whether more subconsciously, the idea of not giving oxygen to these kind of fringe groups promoting wild conspiracy theories, the idea that if we don't give them oxygen, then that'll help prevent people from knowing about them and they won't grow. And what we found is that they just kept growing in the darkness as we ignored them, or as the media ignored them at least. And one of the reasons that I ended up with the sort of public profile I have, where I get invited to talk on RNZ and other radio and TV sometimes, and is because I was writing about these groups at a time when most of the media were operating on the principle of, don't give them oxygen. And then when it got to the point where we couldn't ignore them because they were camped out outside Parliament, then there was this look for who are these people who've been writing about them. So, um, yeah, I think it was the right time to do the book because people wanted to know, like, yeah, who are these people? Where'd they come from? Where do their ideas come from? And so the book was very much aiming to give people answers to those questions that they had after the protest happened. And as we talked about in the first part of this, I only had 6 months to write it because it was a timely issue. Get it out for that first
mm.
anniversary, and then people can get that greater understanding of how this happened and why.
Yeah. We've got about 5 minutes. I guess what summarized in some ways the entire book, but certainly that chapter was this quote where you said, "For nearly a month, a far-right anti-government movement that had been growing restlessly for the better part of a decade was no longer possible to ignore as it forcibly occupied the capital city," which sums it up. I guess the only thing I wanted to ask you there was what do you say to people who might object or push back a bit on the characterization of it as a far right movement? Because some people say,
Mm,
"Oh, well, yeah, we know those groups were there, but there were lots of ordinary people there too."
mm.
What would you
Yeah,
say to
I
that?
think you got to look at what interests those ordinary people were serving. And I think, I've said in other interviews at the time of the protests and things that, we shouldn't categorize every single person there as someone who believes in a far right ideology. But certainly the leadership and the organizers of this event, were people with broadly, far right worldview, whether that is the kind of white supremacy of Action Zealandia who came along as individuals hiding their identities and membership of Action Zealandia, or whether it's the sort of really militant anti-globalism of the likes of Counterspin, or whether it's the broader John Birch Society anti-UN style stuff that you get with some of the people following Tika Hika. The core of that movement was a far right movement, and if people were coming along and allowing themselves to be part of it, they're joining in with that movement even if they're not of it themselves. I in one interview I did around the time of the protest with a community radio show that's put out by the Canterbury Social Society, we talked a bit comparing it with the Occupy movement a decade ago, which I've done an oral history of, the one in Christchurch. And there were conspiracy theorists there. It was the time when the Zeitgeist movement was popular and people were promoting all sorts of fringe theories about banking and fiat
Mhm.
currency and so on, because it's post-financial crisis. And I said those people are always there at Occupy, but they were on the fringes. And with this protest at Parliament, it's as if those types of views are not the fringe but the core. And
Mhm.
so that's what makes me feel like it's okay to broadly define it as a far right movement, although I certainly wouldn't label every single person who attended as being on the far right or holding those far right views. But
Mm.
certainly they were there giving giving their tacit support to the likes of Counterspin Media and Brian Tamaki and others.
Mm. And hence perhaps the value of your book in possibly persuading even some of the people who took part in the protests but were not fully on board with all the ideology, that maybe if they go and look at your book, they'll say, "Oh, I thought the people I was there with were just like me. They were just like ordinary people."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
they might have unwittingly joined over a single issue, a vaccine thing, and not at all realize the full implications of what they were doing and why they were there. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that people who are open-minded about these things will pick it up and think, yeah, maybe I had some concerns about the vaccine or concerns about the UN, or because people come at these concerns from all different perspectives, and I think
Mm,
some people
mm,
who would consider themselves on the left even had concerns about vaccines because of the pharmaceutical industry and it being
yeah.
profit driven and so on, and they ended up getting caught up in this. And people who had uh, you know, anti-globalization and the old sort of Battle of Seattle style
Mm,
anti-globalization, rather than the more conspiracist anti-globalism, who had concerns about global trade and supranational organizations and so on. A lot of those people sort of got caught up in this as well. One of the influences in this space was Vinnie Eastwood, who was
mm,
around like the anti-TPPA movement and
mm,
Occupy and so on, and has now really aligned himself closely with Tika Hika and is pushing, much more like right wing worldview now. But
yeah.
he's probably got an audience who still think of themselves as on the left, and then they're, getting involved in this. So I hope that there are some of those people who can read my book and start to question who they want to allow themselves to be allied with. You're never going to agree with everyone at a mass protest or a mass movement, but maybe this one particular that happened a year ago is the kind of one you want to stay away from, or if those same groups organize something similar, you want to stay away from. And I hope maybe people are doing that even without reading my book, because certainly none of these groups have been able to pull off anything the same size since. And that
Mm,
might indicate that
okay.
some people have been put off by the more extreme beliefs and rhetoric of the likes of Calvin Alp and so forth.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it, Byron.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.